Okay, so we're welcome to a new semester. I'm very excited about this semester. I really love women's health and OB, so this is my favorite semester. We're going to start today with just an overview of female anatomy and physiology. I understand the state of sex education and reproductive health education in this community, in our communities. My kids' high school to this day in the year 2022, the sum total of sex education is an abstinence poster on the girls' bathroom door. So I know that when we were in biology, a lot of our teachers skipped this chapter. And a lot of us may have had messages that we really shouldn't show too much interest in reproductive health. So we're going to go back to basics. And the first thing we're going to do is look at female reproductive anatomy. Another thing I want to mention is when I am talking about female anatomy, I'm talking about the reproductive organs of people who were assigned female at birth. Okay, so I know that we have become more aware of differences in gender and sexuality over the last few decades. So I want to we're looking at female physical anatomy for this lecture. Okay, so let's pull up a diagram. This is probably the most common diagram that you see. Let me get my screen shared. Okay, this is probably the most common diagram that you see when we talk about female anatomy. This is an anterior view of female reproductive anatomy. So we're going to go through the parts. And I want to make sure that you have a good understanding of where these pieces are in relation to each other and what their various functions are, because when we get into OB, it's going to be really important that you understand that. Okay, so this would be the introitus. So here is the vagina. The vagina is the canal. It is not the external genitals. That is the vulva. The vagina is the canal. Here is the uterus, and this closure of the uterus is the cervix. This is a continuous part of the uterus, and in labor, it actually dilates to allow the baby to deliver. So when we talk about dilation, we're not talking about vaginal, we're talking about cervical dilation. That's one important thing to understand. Okay. Something else that you should know, though, is that the cervix remains mostly closed aside from in childbirth, but it does dilate and then close back slightly at various times in the menstrual cycle. Okay, the fallopian tubes lead from the ovaries to the uterus. Okay, so these are the fallopian tubes. The ovaries. So the fallopian tubes and the ovaries aren't actually touching the way they are in this diagram. The ovaries release an ovum. These are fimbriae that kind of sweep that ovum into the fallopian tube. The fallopian tubes have some peristalsis that move the ovum down. If it is fertilized, it's typically fertilized in the fallopian tube for a successful pregnancy because it has to have reached a specific stage of development in order to implant. So if an ovum is actually not fertilized until it's in the uterus, it is less likely to implant successfully. So typically fertilization is going to occur here in the fallopian tubes. Okay, so let's look at a different view now. We're going to look at a side view of internal anatomy again. We have the vagina. Okay, here's the vulva. We have the vagina. We have the uterus. We only have one ovum and fallopian tube in this, or one ovary, sorry, and fallopian tube in this view. So here's the fallopian tube, here's the ovary. If you look where the uterus is located, the bladder is anterior to the uterus. Okay, this is why as the uterus fills, it puts more pressure on the bladder. The rectum is posterior to the vagina. Okay, so let's look now at an external view. We've seen the internal. The entire external genitalia is the vulva. People will say vagina when they really mean vulva. The vagina is the canal. This is the entrance to the vagina called the introitus. Okay, we have the labia majora, which are usually more fatty, thicker. Okay, the mons pubis. This fat provides some protection for sensitive tissues. And then we have the labia minora, which are the thinner membranes on the inside. Okay, the urethral opening is in the vulva. It is inside the labia minora, but it is not typically inside the vagina. Now, if you have cared for older people, in particular, if you've tried to start to place a Foley on an older woman, you may have noticed that at times these tissues become thinner, they become more friable, they get atrophied, and sometimes the urethral opening has, it's not that it actually moves, it's that the tissue has changed position. Sometimes it's changed position because of childbirth injuries and repairs. So sometimes we do actually find the urethral opening almost up inside the vagina, but it can be a little bit more difficult to find. Remember, the bladder is anterior to the uterus, okay? And then the clitoris and the clitoral hood are at the most anterior. And remember, when we're placing a catheter, we told you make sure that you are not placing that catheter under the clitoral hood. Okay, and then the anus is posterior. So I know that that's very basic, but I also know that a lot of us did not get this information when we were in school. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to talk about menarche and the menstrual cycle.